All right. Good afternoon, everybody. While you guys are filing in, getting your food, I'll get us started here because we have a great program today. I'm Jürgen Honutzer. I chair the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And I'm pleased to welcome a very special grand round speaker who's visiting us from the University of Minnesota, Dr. Carl Elliott. Jay Gandhi will introduce Dr. Elliott a little bit more formally in just a minute, but before we get started on this grand rounds, we have a very special occasion. I'm going to introduce Alicia and Stephanie, who are representing the UW House Staff Quality and Safety Committee, who are going to present a very special award to our own Dr. Mark Snowden. Alicia and Stephanie, why don't you guys come up?
Great, thank you, Dr. Minister. So I'm Alicia Furman, this is Stephanie Carr. We're the co-chairs of the UW House Staff Quality and Safety Committee, or HQSC. And we are here on behalf of the HQSC to present an award to Dr. Mark Snowden. It's the Gene Peterson Award for Excellence in Quality Improvement Mentorship. This award is named in honor of quality and safety pioneer Dr. Gene Peterson. He worked for many years at UWMC, and I know some of the faculty here in the room worked with him. He was the Associate Medical Director and Co-Director of the Center for Clinical Excellence. He's most remembered for his work integrating resident physician training with the quality and safety initiatives of the hospital and clinics. This annual resident nominated award is presented to a faculty member who demonstrates dedication and commitment to resident education in the areas of quality improvement and patient safety.
So we have a few excerpts from Dr. Snowden's nomination. So first, he has been an exceptional advocate, mentor, and educator of psychiatry residents. Second, he is a passionate, balanced, thoughtful, knowledgeable, and dedicated to the care of our patients, improving our healthcare system, and furthering the professional and personal development of our trainees, staff, and faculty. And he is a role model to the residents in our program and inspires us to do better. And there were actually more nominations than that. That's just a few of the excerpts. So please join me in congratulating Dr. Snowden. This is quite awesome.
Thank you. Just take a quick picture. Yep. Oh, sure. Thanks, Dan.
So I'll also want to congratulate and thank Mark. Mark actually spent 3 hours yesterday teaching our R3s about QI. He's keeping right at it. I want to thank the two of you for your nomination. I also had the pleasure to work with Gene Peterson. I can't think of a better fit for an award named after Gene than Mark. So thank you both. Now I'm going to introduce Jay Gandhi, who's going to introduce our grand round speaker.
All right, hi. Some of you may know me. I've been a resident here for a little bit. Now a psychiatry consult fellow. So I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Carl Elliott today. Dr. Elliott is professor in the Center for Bioethics in the Department of Pediatrics and an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Philosophy and the School of Journalism and Mass Communications. He is the author or editor of 7 books, including White Coat, Black Hat, which I will add is one of my personal favorite nonfiction books, and Better Than Well, American Medicine Meets the American Dream. His articles have appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic Monthly, the London Review of Books, Mother Jones, the New York Times, and the New England Journal of Medicine. Dr. Carl Elliott.
Slow this down. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. I should say I've talked about this case, the case of Dan Markingson, a lot, dozens if not hundreds of times. But this is the only the second psychiatry department that's ever invited me to talk about it. And the first one was my brother's, so I don't think that actually counts. So maybe y'all are the first. I'm going to do my best to leave you thoroughly demoralized and depressed by the end of the hour.
That's what we need on a beautiful Seattle summer day.
Yeah. So let me just start by showing you this headline from 2 years ago. This was when my university, the University of Minnesota, was ordered to suspend recruitment into psychiatric drug studies. Soon after that announcement, the chair of our psychiatry department resigned, and the university announced that it was going to start an $8 million effort to fix its human subjects protection program. So the approximate cause of all this was the death of mentally ill research subject named Dan Markingson. That came to light in 2008 in the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and then I wrote about it 2 years later in Mother Jones magazine. If I tell you that there was an 11-year gap between Dan Markingson's death in 2004 and the suspension of those trials in 2015, you can probably guess there's a lot more to the story. So what I'm going to try to do today is tell you the story and then try to put it in the context of a larger story, which is a story about just how difficult it is to get unethical research stopped, even when it's obviously unethical, and why that is. So the story begins with a woman named Mary Weiss, pictured here with her son, Dan. Mary's from St. Paul. They both are. Mary was a single mom when she raised Dan in South St. Paul. When he finished high school, went off to the University of Michigan, did an English degree there, and afterwards moved out to LA in hopes of becoming a screenwriter. So in the summer of 2003, which is where this whole story begins really, is Dan's living in LA. Mary goes out there to visit him, and when she gets there, it's clear that something is very wrong. He's behaving really bizarrely. He's got this wooden wall of blocks built around his bed with dollar bills in between them. He says this is to protect him from the aliens that keep visiting him in his apartment. He's talking about a kind of apocalyptic event, which he seems to think Mary knows something about. She has no idea what he's talking about. And he's behaving so bizarrely, she panics and she calls 911. But when the police get there, Dan is able to convince her that his mother's overreacting and he's just fine, and they believe him. Mary tries to get Dan to come back to Minnesota with her. He doesn't want to. He goes, comes back, eventually winds up in the fall of 2003 back in St. Paul. So by this point, it's becoming pretty clear that he's not just delusional, he's actually also very dangerous. He's got these delusions that revolve around a kind of satanic cult that he is convinced is orchestrating this apocalyptic event in Duluth, Minnesota, and that he has a part to play in this event, and the part he is supposed to play is mass murder. And one of the people that he is supposed to murder is his mother. You can sort of see the extent of his delusions from these emails that he's sending in September of that year. So by November, Mary is very alarmed, and he says some things that makes her think that she needs to call the police. And so she does. And this time, he winds up in the hospital, in our teaching hospital, Fairview Hospital at the University of Minnesota, where he's seen by the head of our schizophrenia program at the time, Dr. Steve Olson. Olson examines him. He thinks that Dan is psychotic, that he's dangerous. In fact, so dangerous that he needs to be involuntarily committed. Now, in Minnesota, if you want to give patients neuroleptic drugs, you have to get their written consent, unless they're not competent. Olson writes in Dan's chart that he is not competent to make decisions whether or not to take neuroleptics. A few days later, he's seen by a clinical psychologist who says pretty much the same thing, that Dan is incompetent, that he's dangerous, he needs to be involuntarily committed. He notes in the chart that Dan believes his mother is a lizard and has threatened to slit her throat. And then there's a third evaluation, which is consistent with the first two. So it's pretty clear from these evaluations that Dan is still very impaired. So as you know, involuntary commitment is a legal procedure. It's for patients who are mentally ill and dangerous to themselves or others. In Minnesota, there's an alternative called a stay of commitment. And what a stay of commitment means is that you can avoid actually being locked up as long as you agree to do what your psychiatrist says. So on November 20th, that's what Olson recommends for Dan, that he be given a stay of commitment, and which means that he can avoid going to the state hospital, and the court agrees. Then Olson does something unusual. Instead of just treating Dan, he asks Dan to sign up for an industry-sponsored drug study. And Dan says, yes. And he signs the consent form when his mother's not there. Mary comes in the next day. She finds out that he's in this drug study, and she's stunned. She doesn't want him in a study. He's psychotic. He's delusional. He's threatening to kill her. And just a couple of days before, everybody who had seen him had agreed that he was incompetent to consent to take antipsychotic drugs. So she wants to know, if he's incompetent to consent to take them, how can he possibly be competent to consent to a study of the same drugs? And how can anybody be considered to be giving free and voluntary consent when the alternative is being sent to the state mental institution? Mary tells Olson, the attending, I don't want him in this study. She's told, it's not your choice, it's his choice. He signed the consent form, he's in the study. So, what was that study? This is it. It's funded by AstraZeneca. It's called the CAFE study. It's an acronym, CAFE, Comparison of Atypicals in First Episode Psychosis. So it's aimed at patients having their first psychotic break. It lasts a year. Subjects are supposed to get one of 3 different antipsychotic drugs, one of the 3 atypicals available at the time. It's randomized, it's blinded. So Dan doesn't know what drug he's getting. Olson doesn't know what drug he's getting. That's blind to both of them. Olson is the PI. The co-PI, the co-investigator is the department chair, Charles Schultz. So there's a red flag that I want to point out at this point. This is not something that was obvious, clearly not to Dan or Mary. It's a red flag about money. So Dan's on public assistance. It's the Minnesota version of Medicaid. And ordinarily, if somebody like that turns up at the hospital, they're a money loser, right, because of how low Medicaid reimbursement rates are. But if they're enrolled in a trial, that financial equation changes. So AstraZeneca is giving the University of Minnesota Department of Psychiatry $15,000 in change for each subject they enroll in the trial. $327,000, it turns out, in total. Now, that money doesn't go into Olson's pocket, of course, at least not directly, although it is used to pay part of his salary. But he is also getting money directly in his pocket from AstraZeneca. So he's part of the AstraZeneca Speakers Bureau. In fact, is a Speakers Bureau for every atypical antipsychotic manufacturer. Same is true for Schultz. Here's basically how much money they had gotten in the last 5 years or so before the trial started. So, fair amount of money. So that seems a little alarming, but it's not all. When the CAFE study was approved by the University of Minnesota IRB, the IRB panel that approved and reviewed the study was chaired by a psychiatrist named David Adson. Now, why is that significant? Well, a few reasons. One, he is a colleague of Olson and Schultz in the psych department, so he answers to the co-investigator of the study. Two, he directs the ambulatory research study. That's the center that's housing the cafe study, right? Three, he's on the payroll of AstraZeneca. In fact, he's on the payroll of almost every antipsychotic manufacturer, at least $650,000 in pharma payments from 2002 to 2010. And in case you're wondering how somebody getting so much pharma money can get away with chairing the IRB panel with such a large conflict of interest, there's an explanation, which is that he's on the conflict of interest committee too. So Dan stays at the hospital for about 2 more weeks, and then he's transferred to halfway house in St. Paul, where he starts to deteriorate. According to Mary, he starts to get reclusive. He stops changing his clothes. His thoughts get more grandiose and more delusional. And the most alarming thing to Mary, to his mother, was how angry and agitated and sort of tense he became. She said it was like he was about to explode any minute. At this point, she's trying everything that she can think of to get him out of the study. She is writing letters, she is calling, she is leaving voicemails, she is turning up in the Department of Psychiatry, trying to get a meeting, nothing. All told, she writes 5 letters to Olson and Schultz, telling them how worried she is, how angry Dan is becoming. Finally, in April of 2004, she leaves a voice message with the study coordinator saying, "Do we have to wait until he kills himself or somebody else before anybody does anything?" 3 weeks after she leaves that message, early on the morning of May 8th, Mary gets a knock on her door. And it's 2 people. One's a Catholic priest, the other is a police officer. And they say, we're sorry to tell you that Dan has passed away. They didn't tell her how at the time. Later she learned that he had stabbed himself to death in the shower of the halfway house with a utility knife so violently that he nearly decapitated himself. His body was discovered in the bathroom early in the morning by a halfway house worker, along with a note on the nightstand that said, "I went through this experience smiling." Later, when Mary had his medication analyzed, it turned out that he was actually being treated with Seroquel, which is the drug made by the study sponsor. So at this point, let me step back a minute and just say a few things about the cafe study and the atypicals and some litigation. Now, if you can remember way back to the days before the atypicals, you will remember that antipsychotics used to be seen as very unpleasant drugs, extraordinarily unpleasant, potentially dangerous, largely because of the extrapyramidal side effects. Reserved largely for patients with very severe disease, mainly schizophrenia. In the 1990s, of course, that started to change. And that was when the industry started rolling out the so-called atypical or second-generation antipsychotics. First, Risperdal, then Zyprexa, then Seroquel. They pitched the drugs as a kind of new and improved antipsychotic, more effective than your grandfather's neuroleptics with all those nasty side effects. Hugely expensive, but if you can avoid tardive dyskinesia, it looks like a decent trade-off. So they take off. Within about 10 years, antipsychotics are not just for schizophrenia anymore. They're for anxiety, for agitation, for dementia, for insomnia, for ADHD, for depression, for bipolar disorder, everything that you can think of. And so by 2008, they had become the single most profitable class of drugs in America. So more profitable than statins, more profitable than antidepressants, more profitable than anything. In fact, in 2008, Seroquel alone was the 5th most profitable drug in America, about $4 billion a year in sales. So within a period of about 10 years, we went from thinking of antipsychotics like that to thinking of antipsychotics like that. Right. By the time Dan's Markings' death became public in 2008, backlash against antipsychotics had started, both medically and legally. The biggest blow, or I should say, the first one was this big federally funded study, the Katie study in the New England Journal of Medicine, comparing the atypicals to an older antipsychotic that had been around since the 60s. So what that found was, one, atypicals didn't really work any better than the older drug, that 75% of patients stopped taking them no matter what drug they were taking. And third, despite all that industry hype, side effect profiles were generally no better than the older drug. So it's around this time that the litigation starts. Turns out that atypicals also make people gain weight, that they increase their risk of diabetes, and that the companies have known about that for at least a decade and have hidden it, right? In 2009, Lilly, which makes Zyprexa, settled a $1.4 billion fraud lawsuit. At the time, that was the largest healthcare fraud lawsuit in American history. It's since been exceeded a number of times, including similar lawsuits against every atypical manufacturer. Shortly after Zyprexa came Seroquel. AstraZeneca was eventually forced to pay over $500 million in federal penalties for fraud. And this is around the time, shortly after Dan's death in 2008, 2009, 2010. And so as the litigation's going on, these documents are being unsealed. And I'm following this very closely. And as those documents start to be unsealed, two things become pretty clear. One, AstraZeneca has been manipulating their research to make Seroquel look much better than it actually is. And two, those fraudulent studies were leading back to the University of Minnesota. So let me just show you some of those documents. I got tons of them, but I'll just show you some of the highlights. So this is an internal email from a publications manager at AstraZeneca who's actually worried about what they're doing, worried about the ethics, worried about the optics. He says, look, we're cherry picking data. We've buried trials 15, 31, and 56. Now we're considering burying this other trial. How are we going to face the world when they find out that we're suppressing data? The most interesting slides for me were the ones that trace back to my university. I'll just show you a couple. This is an internal email about a trial called Study 41, which compared the extended release version of Seroquel to placebo. And one of the places where that was done was the University of Minnesota. Kind of remarkably, what it showed was that Seroquel was no better than placebo for schizophrenia. Not the kind of result that you're looking for if you're AstraZeneca, which is why it's called in this email a code red failed study. So what do you do with a study like that? Well, what they did was first not publish it. They buried it for 6 years and then redid it. But when they redid it, they didn't do it at the University of Minnesota. They did it in India, Bulgaria, Romania, the Philippines, Russia, Greece, and South Africa. So all the sites were in the developing world. And this time it turned out positively. And so they published that one and then pumped that in their press releases. As you can see, Charles Schultz, our chair, is the second author of that study, and he's also the front man in the PR, claiming that the drug is actually superior to placebo. So that's one study, Study 41. This is an even more alarming email about a trial called Study 15. So that's an earlier one. That's comparing Seroquel to, the standard version of Seroquel to Haldol. So old antipsychotic around since the 60s. And what that found was that Seroquel was no better than Haldol and on a lot of measures worse than Haldol. So yet again, they've got a study that if they publish it, it could damage their drug. So what do? Well, this time they decide to do what they call a smoke and mirrors job on it, to spin it. And the front man for the smoke and mirrors is, once again, our department chair, Charles Schultz. So he's quoted in this press release speaking about the dramatic benefits of Seroquel over Haldol. And eventually, when the documents are unsealed, he's caught. This is from our local paper, the Star Tribune. So you're probably wondering about the CAFE study, the study in which Dan died. Now, the CAFE study, as far as I could find, was not mentioned in any of those unsealed documents. But there are some fishy things about it. If you look at it, the first thing that might strike you about it, what struck me, was the outcome measure. So the CAFE study was supposed to be a comparative effectiveness study. But the effectiveness, the outcome measure for effectiveness is how long subjects take the drugs. So they're measuring effectiveness by the amount of time a subject takes the drug before he finally quits taking the drug. The longer you take it, the more effective it is. Seems like you might want to measure how it actually affects the patient's condition, but what do I know about psychiatry? That seems strange to me. When I showed it to people who know a lot more about psych trials than I do, that wasn't really what bothered them. What bothered them was the sample size. Basically, they said, look, this trial is underpowered. There's no way that a sample size like that, only 120 subjects finishing the trial, is going to detect a difference between those three drugs. And so the failure to detect a difference is then spun by AstraZeneca as our drug is equivalent to the other two drugs on the market. So the thing I would want to point out about this is that study is not unusual. That is a very familiar drug industry trick. You rig the trials to make sure that your drug wins. A lot of ways to do this. There's a very good piece by Richard Smith, the former editor of the BMJ, about it. You can do it by underpowering your trial. You can underdose the competitor drug so that it looks less effective than yours. You can overdose the competitor drug so it looks more toxic than yours. If you can do this or any of a number of other very sophisticated statistical tricks, you don't need to spin your data. You just design the trial to get the data that you want. And so for the neuroleptics, this is exactly how things have played out. Whoever funds the trial wins. So you may have seen this article in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 2006. This was a study that looked at 32 head-to-head trials of atypicals. So studies very much like the CAFE study. Phase 4 trials comparing one atypical to the others. And what they found was that 90% of them came out positively for whichever company had designed and sponsored the trial. AstraZeneca designs the trial, Seroquel wins. Lilly designs the trial, Zyprexa wins. Janssen designs the trial, Risperdal wins. That's how you do it. So that's the background. Let me just review here. What do we have? We have a class of drugs, the atypicals, that have become enormously profitable on the basis of a falsehood. We've got evidence that AstraZeneca has been intentionally manipulating research to make their atypical look better than it really is. And we've got a link to the University of Minnesota, where a young man has committed suicide after being coerced into a rigged Seroquel trial that was very profitable for the university. So what happened when Dan died? Well, a few things. First thing is that Olson filed an adverse event report with the IRB, as you're required to do. The IRB filed it away. No questions. Research subject tries to decapitate himself in the shower, and the IRB has 0 questions for the investigator. The FDA comes in. They investigate. They conclude that neither AstraZeneca, nor the university, nor the doctors bore any blame whatsoever for Dan's death. If you read the report, there's no mention of any of the financial conflicts of interest. There's no mention of the fact that Dan was threatening to kill people. There's no mention that Mary tried for months to get him out of the trial. And as for the fact that Dan was floridly psychotic and under a commitment order, according to the FDA, That's not a problem. Mary eventually sues the University of Minnesota. That goes nowhere. The judge dismisses the suit with a summary judgment, ruling that the University of Minnesota is statutorily immune from lawsuit. So the ruling is, no matter what the merits of the case, the University of Minnesota cannot be sued. When Mary's lawsuit is dismissed, the University of Minnesota retaliates by filing a legal action against her. It's called a notice to assess cost. They demanded that she pay the University of Minnesota $57,000 to cover its legal expenses, mainly the expenses of the expert witnesses that it had hired to defend itself in the lawsuit. A lot of psychiatrists lined up behind the U, including, I should say, Paul Applebaum, a former president of the APA and a well-known psychiatric ethicist. The university eventually agreed to drop that demand as long as Mary gave up her rights to appeal the judgment, appeal the immunity ruling. And on the advice of her lawyer, she did that. So if you were shocked that a university in an allegedly progressive state would file a legal action against the mother of a dead research subject who committed suicide in a university drug study, you should be. I was. But what you should understand is it's way worse than you can imagine. That scandal is just one of a long series of scandals in our Department of Psychiatry. I'll just go over a few of those. The first was when our head of child and adolescent psychiatry was sent to federal prison. That was a research fraud case. He was later disqualified by the FDA from ever doing research again. Shortly after that, the head of our chemical dependency program was also disqualified by the FDA for recruiting illiterate Hmong opium addicts into a GHB study without getting informed consent. They didn't even know they were in a study. I should mention, he was a member of the IRB when he was doing that study. He was also disqualified. There was also one of our former faculty members and a clinical faculty member who had his license suspended when the state medical board found him responsible for the deaths and injuries of 46 of his patients, 17 of whom were research subjects in industry-funded studies he was doing, most of them in our teaching hospital. 5 of those were suicides. He was sentenced to take an ethics course with me. Apparently didn't help. He was recently disciplined again by the medical board. So those are just the highlights. I could go on, and maybe in Q&A I can tell you about the more recent scandals. Those are just the previous ones. You know from my first slide how this all eventually turned out, which was the university was forced to concede wrongdoing. What I want to emphasize to you, without belaboring the point, is the sheer amount of time and effort and mental anguish it took to get to that point. It took 7 years, basically, of full-time work. Protests, petitions, letters, editorials, magazine articles, freedom of information requests, letters to alumni, letters from alumni, letters to donors asking them not to give any more money to the University of Minnesota, complaints to virtually every oversight body in the federal government and at the university and at the state. And for 7 years, the university insisted that it had done nothing wrong, that the psychiatrists bore no blame, that our IRB was the envy of the country, and that the sole reason for the controversy was a single disgruntled faculty member with a vendetta against the university. That would be me. And, you know, to be honest, that's probably where we would be today if not for one completely unexpected thing. And even now, it seems amazing to me. Like kind of like a superhero burst into the room and put all the bad guys in cuffs and took them away. This is what the superhero looks like. His name is Arnie Carlson. He is a former governor of Minnesota, very popular two-term Republican governor of Minnesota in the 1990s, and known as a huge backer of the University of Minnesota. The University of Minnesota probably had never had as much of a friend in the governor's office as it did when Arnie Carlson was governor. And in 2013, he started to speak out publicly about the case. And by speaking out, what I mean is he said it was the worst scandal in the history of the university, and that the president and the board of regents and all the senior managers at the university should be fired immediately. And he didn't just say it once. He said it on TV, in the newspaper, on the radio, to anybody who asked, constantly. And that got people's attention in a way that neither I nor any of the other faculty members at the university had ever been able to do. And so eventually we got our external investigations. And in the spring of 2015, the results of those came in, one fairly soon after the other. The first one was commissioned by our faculty senate. The second one was done by the state legislative auditor, which is a kind of a state watchdog agency. And they were blistering. I mean, they found coercion, they found conflicts of interest, they found a toxic culture of intimidation in the Department of Psychiatry that prevented people from speaking out when they saw wrongdoing. They pointed out a very badly flawed research oversight system, and a series of false and misleading statements by university administrators intended to deflect any kind of scrutiny of the case. And so in the end, we did get at least some kind of vindication. Not in the eyes of the university. Haven't gotten any thank you notes from university administrators, but at least publicly. Now, I promise to demoralize you, and if I leave things there with a kind of upbeat ending, you might be tempted to feel good about this rather than demoralized, and I wouldn't want that to happen. So let me try to bring the mood down a little by pointing out a couple of things. One of them about our scandal in particular, and the other one about research scandals in general. So the first thing about our scandal in particular. So during the 7 years that we worked to get those investigations, we got a tremendous amount of support on campus from faculty members and from students. So it was students who delivered this black coffin to the Board of Regents on the anniversary of Dan Markingson's death. I will point out that I actually built the coffin. And it was faculty members who stood up to the administration and got one of those two external reviews commissioned. But when I say faculty, I don't mean medical faculty. I mean faculty members in the humanities and social sciences. There was not a single physician at the University of Minnesota who supported us publicly or even privately. Not one. Of the 4,000 people who signed a petition calling on the governor of Minnesota to investigate, there wasn't a single University of Minnesota doctor on the list. To a person, they lined up with the university administration. So that is, that's the thing about our scandal that I wanted to mention. The second thing is about scandals in particular.
Well,
sure.
Before you leave this topic,
Mm-hmm.
do you feel like the physicians had good information about how bad things were? Like, or I'm just trying to imagine if I heard this kind of news here, it would be hard to know how complete the information is that I was getting. Did you feel like that they had the information to?
They had the same information that everyone else in the university had. They just reacted very differently.
Which included everything about the conflicts of interest and the...
There was a 4-part series in the St. Paul Pioneer Press. I wrote about the piece for Mother Jones Magazine.
This was after all that.
I put all the documents for my article online so anybody could see everything that I've showed you and more.
Oh, okay.
But maybe you can get maybe there's a partial answer to your question by what I want to tell you about research scandals in general. Because what I did a couple of years ago mainly as a way of trying to understand what had happened at our university, is start teaching a seminar on research scandals in general. So, it's all scandals all the time, 2 a week for a semester. And one of the things that we look at in that course is look at the notorious scandals of the 60s and 70s, the ones that generated our research oversight system. So Tuskegee, Willowbrook, those. The ones that you should have learned about in a medical ethics course at some point. And so I started to wonder, one thing they never tell us in those courses or in the textbooks is whatever happened to the doctors who did those studies, right? Were they sanctioned? Like, were they disgraced? I mean, what happened to them? Well, I'll show you what happened to them. So this is Saul Krugman. He's the NYU pediatrician who fed the hepatitis A virus to institutionalized mentally disabled children at the Willowbrook School in Staten Island. What happened to him when that was exposed? He was elected president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. This is Chester Southam. He's the one who injected live cancer cells into elderly patients at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in New York. What happened to him? He was elected president of the American Association for Cancer Research. This is one who might be familiar to you if you know Tuskegee. This is John Cutler. He's the guy, one of the many Tuskegee researchers, but he was well known as the one who defended the study for decades after, after it was exposed, and was later discovered to have conducted the Guatemala syphilis study as well, the one that President Obama apologized for in, I think, 2011. What happened to him? He was named acting dean and department chair at the University of Pittsburgh and got a named lectureship in his honor. Eugene Sanger, he's the radiologist at the University of Cincinnati, who was funded by the Pentagon to give whole body radiation to 90 cancer patients without their consent in order to see how soldiers might react to being irradiated by a nuclear bomb in the case of a nuclear attack. In 1994, he was given a gold medal by the Radiological Society of North America. And then finally, Dr. Albert Kligman. He's the University of Pennsylvania dermatologist, the one who said when he looked at the prisoners at Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania that what he saw was acres of skin, like a farmer gazing on a fertile field. He gave 75 of them the toxic chemical in Agent Orange in exchange for $10,000 from Dow Chemicals. What happened to him? Honorary degrees in Holland and Germany and presidency of the Society for Investigative Dermatology. So to go back to your question, to go back to the question I started with, why is it so hard to stop unethical research? Well, I think that's at least the beginning of the answer. Because if you're a doctor and you speak out against unethical research, chances are you'll be vilified. You'll be isolated. There'll be retaliation against you. You'll risk your career. But if you do unethical research, chances are you'll be rewarded. And I think that's a fairly perverse system of incentives. And I should add that nobody at the University of Minnesota has been punished for anything that has happened there in our Department of Psychiatry.
They're all still employed there?
Olson is still employed. Yeah. Schultz resigned with a lot of praise and acclamation by the University of Minnesota administration and insistence that, the timing of his resignation was completely coincidental and had nothing to do with the scandals. All right, good. It seems like I brought the room down. Thank you.
There's one other data point, though, Milgram, that he had that originally that was thought to be terrific research to see how far you could push people to go in shocking the subjects that didn't know that was the point of the study. And I think that within his lifetime that became frowned upon. And I think actually he suffered some sanctions for that, didn't he? Or?
I don't think he suffered any sanctions, but his career never went the way he had thought it would afterwards. He did a lot of other interesting research after that, but he didn't when he did that research, he was at Yale, and I think he did not, I don't know if he was denied tenure at Yale, but he didn't finish his career at Yale. But I think, his research is relevant to, what happens to whistleblowers. It's actually been replicated a number of times, and most recently by a group that was studying whistleblowing. And they set up a Milgram-like experiment to find out how many people would blow the whistle on an obviously unethical experiment. And the answer was about 9%. So 91% didn't.
So obviously the research that's done by pharmaceutical companies seems obviously biased because it's about profit. I mean, there are no really clear regulations or guidance that really makes sure that that bias is not in place. Basically, I don't trust any research that's done by pharmaceutical companies. I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's wise. But I think the difficulty is that what you actually see and what actually has been done. There's a big gap between that. I mean, you only really find out the full extent of the studies that have gone the other way and not been published, or the studies that have been spun or rigged when there's litigation. And the litigation almost always comes at the end of the patent life of a drug. I mean, it's funny how it happens that way.
It almost seems like we can only count on another pharmaceutical company exposing the flaws of what, I mean, it seems like that's.
No, they don't expose it one another. It's the Justice Department that does it. Yeah.
So why does this happen?
Why does it happen?
Yes.
Well, in general, I would have said, for the people people like this that I put up, I think is largely about career advancement and hubris and the absence of proper oversight. Why does it happen now? I think it's largely about money. If you look at what happened at the University of Minnesota, the background is that there's a tremendous amount of pressure on a lot of departments to bring in industry money. And there's a lot of, contracts are written so that faculty members are expected to generate a large proportion of their own salaries, either by seeing patients or by getting grants or some other way. And if you're not getting NIH grants, then these kind of trials are very attractive. I mean, I think starting in the kind of late 1990s, if you look at what happened at the University of Pennsylvania with the death of Jesse Gelsinger, or what happened at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Institute here, in the series that was exposed in the Seattle Times by Duff Wilson and David Heath, huge financial conflicts of interest. And we're talking about millions of dollars at stake, even billions. You didn't have that in the old days. But what we have now is a research oversight system that's not set up to take those kinds of financial incentives and conflicts of interest into account.
So I had an interesting experience some years ago, 10 years ago. I was a whistleblower with regards to a matter which, fortunately, my name didn't get published in the Seattle paper. It did in the Washington, D.C. version, I guess down in Los Angeles. But there was a matter which I could have worked for this company that was going to be charging many times what the government was paying for a particular service. And it was going to be outsourced from the federal government to a fellow who was the former secretary of the VA, who, as he left, his company got this $1 billion contract, and it was interesting. I got a call at one point the Committee on Oversight and Investigation back in Washington, D.C. wanted to talk to me. Of course, they didn't want to give me their names at first. I said, well, I would talk to them. I'd like to know who it is I'm talking to.
That seems weird.
Democrats and Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
And it was our almost 2-hour conversation, which was recorded. They lost all but about 15 minutes of that, which was rather garbled. So it's interesting that they really didn't want to hear what the story was. And so, nothing ever came of that. But anyway, so whether that will cheer you up, it's not always so good that people don't really want to look over things too terribly closely.
Yeah.
And, they came with certain prejudiced ideas, which, they have corrected.
Yeah. Another reason to be depressed. Thank you.
Department of Psychiatry at your university, do they have a tenure system for physicians so that they might have felt safer, like professors in other departments like social sciences and liberal arts have a tenure system at those places?
Yeah. Yes, they do. Didn't help.
So you're supposed to be University of Minnesota,
I am.
and how have you been treated there?
Well, by my friends and allies in humanities and social science in the Department of Philosophy and Anthropology and Journalism, very well. In the medical school, most people won't even talk to me, to be honest.
Why is that? Do they tell you ongoing reasons?
Well, they don't talk to me. I mean, people that I've known for years will, if they see me coming, they will duck in the hallway or look straight ahead. Will not. When the whole thing was happening, the arguments that I would get. A few things. So when I first began, and before I wrote the piece in Mother Jones was what really began to make me sort of persona non grata. I talked to hospital attorneys, the dean of the medical school. I had a couple of friends in the Department of Psychiatry, and the story I got from them, they did not see anything. To be honest, I don't think that most of them had even paid any attention to the scandal at all. And what little attention they did pay, they just said to me, "You can't believe anything you read in the newspapers." It was, the reporters were in the pocket of the family. The real story here is that the mom was crazy and she drove her son to suicide. But of course, we can't tell the press that sort of thing. And so I knew one of the reporters. He's a very good reporter, Paul Tosto. He and Jeremy Olson wound up winning a journalism prize for this. And he said, we had no complaints about, no requests for retraction, no complaints about this, no issues at all. But, the mother's not crazy. You can talk to her. And so I did. And her reaction was, she seemed totally reasonable to me, extremely angry, but, everything she told me, her reaction was very different. What she said was, you don't have to believe me. Just look at the records. I will tell my lawyer to let you see anything you want. And I just spent a couple of days at the law office going over the depositions and the medical files and the study records and everything. And, everything that she told me was right. In fact, the study looked worse than it had been made out to be in the Pioneer Press, which is why I wound up writing about it for Mother Jones, because all these unsealed documents with the AstraZeneca litigation had come out by then. The argument I got from a lot of my colleagues in the Bioethics Center, most of whom were not on my side. There was one very kind of strong ally, Lee Turner, who was, but it was basically Lee and me against everybody else. And the argument I got was, of course this is a terrible thing, but, terrible things go on everywhere. Academic health centers are sewers. Why are you picking on our university? Go after another one. All this is going to do is blow back on us. The Bioethics Center is going to be punished as a result of you doing this. And it's turned out to be correct, actually. they are being punished.
What
Sure.
was the dose of Seroquel that he ended on?
You know, I can't remember. I have it somewhere, but I
Was it-
can't
it was like
remember.
100 milligrams twice a day. That would really contrary to practice or something. So, was it an outrageous dose or a small dose? Or?
I honestly can't remember. You know, I don't remember thinking. I remember some people telling me that the dose range for the 3 atypicals seemed off to them, but I can't remember exactly what it was. I do remember getting a copy of the pathology report and showing it to some toxicologists and saying, you know, this is how much Seroquel he had in his blood when the autopsy was done. This is when the autopsy was done. You know, can you tell me whether he was getting an adequate dose of Seroquel, whether he's taking it, whether he's not taking it? And they said, you know, if he had that much Seroquel in his blood at that particular time, he was taking the drug, because that wasn't clear in the initial newspaper reporting, or in the litigation. But how much it was exactly, I can't remember.
What did the university spend that $8 million on in terms of improving their IRB
Oh,
process?
it's like it's sad. Mainly on sort of a new computer system for tracking. I mean, one of the things that I found out, one of the things that made the whole thing so frustrating was there were a lot of documents about things that I'd found out, you know, about these other Seroquel studies at the university that were not in the original litigation, and so I had to file sort of the state equivalent of a Freedom of Information request to the university to get this. And, you know, they fought tooth and nail to prevent me from getting, like, every request that I made. You know, they would delay, they would tell me they couldn't find it, they would tell me, you know, that I had to pay an outrageous amount of money to cover administrative costs to dig these things up. And apparently, you know, I think a lot of that was just legal stonewalling, but part of it was that every record that the university kept was paper records, even then. And so one thing they used that $8 million for was to upgrade to a computerized system. And they've also started paying IRB members, which they hadn't done in the past.
Because I feel like here, like, if you want to change a word in the consent form, they will, you know, threaten to shut you down until you've gotten full approval. Where,
Yeah.
you know, let alone if somebody harmed themselves or attempted suicide, or committed suicide.
Well, that's the thing. I was on the IRB at the University of Minnesota for several years. I've been on a number of IRBs, and the University of Minnesota IRB would do that. You know, if you wanted to change a word in a consent form, they would make it like the bureaucracy around that was terrible. And we always, or somebody on the committee, it was never me, always had some objection to some word in the consent form. That, to me, is like a large issue with IRBs in general, like nitpicking over this small bore stuff and then ignoring, you know, someone who's decapitated himself in the shower. Yeah. That's the crazy thing about it. It's not a way to protect patients, that's for sure.
You made my head spin, so I might have missed some things. Did the president or regents get fired?
Oh, no, God, no.
Was there any more legal action?
No, there was no possibility of legal action.
Because it sounds like low-hanging fruit for legal action.
No, the ruling was that the University of Minnesota could not be sued for grounds of immunity. And they had, I think the university lawyers realized that they were lucky to get that ruling, and so that's why they went so hard after Mary Weiss and threatened to make her pay $57,000 that she didn't have unless she agreed to give up her rights of appeal. And so they're really, I mean, it was part of what made the whole thing so difficult for us, is that on the face of it, if you look at the facts of the case, it seems obviously unethical, like in so many different ways. But
it was never sued for anything?
as they were sued for the fraud.
Oh, that's right.
Right. Yeah. They were. Yeah. They had to pay that. But the AstraZeneca, she actually sued, Mary Weiss actually sued AstraZeneca as well, and that one was dismissed. But all the documents for that were sealed away, and I was never able to see them. That all seems, that side of things seems kind of mysterious to me, and I really don't know what happened, but nobody can talk about it. I can't see the documents, so I didn't dig in.
Formidable enemy for it. Well-funded and
Yeah.
well-experienced.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did the mother get anything in?
She got a sort of half-hearted apology from the president. I mean, the I was actually there in the legislature over the Capitol building when the legislative auditor came and delivered his report to the legislature. And I mean, there were like 3 of us from the Dan Markingson side, and every university lawyer, administrator, every member of the Board of Regents was lined up on the other side. And when the whole thing basically came out in our favor, the president of the university, I mean, he had seen it the day before, so he had a prepared statement. And his response was basically, I'm shocked to find out that there's misconduct going on in our Department of Psychiatry. I had no idea. This is, completely blindsided by this whole thing, which was, obviously fairly disingenuous when, medical students have delivered a black coffin in a meeting to you. It's like, I mean, come on. But, I have to say, I feel as if public opinion through the whole affair weighed very much in our favor through this whole thing. And I think it became fairly clear to the president of the university that this was not playing very well. And so eventually, over time, after first not making any apologies and not really saying anything beyond, well, we may have come up a little short. We may not have, met the high expectations that we set for ourselves or something like this, that he actually needed to do more. And he did sort of offer a grudging apology to Mary Weiss, but really that's about it. All right.
Right.
Thank you.
I want to give a huge thanks to Dr. Elliott. Interesting that we're only the second psychiatry department that you've given this presentation to. I will say a few things. First of all, thank you for this sobering and thought-provoking presentation. We're all humans. We're all at risk for all the things that you talked about. I just want to be clear about that. In our case, we have virtually no industry-sponsored research or drug trials, and that's not a complete accident because it is so difficult, I think, to manage all the conflicts that come with that. Every one of us who's a faculty member has to fill out a form called 1460. I bug you guys about this every year. That is to acknowledge any amount of outside professional work for which you're getting some kind of compensation. And that's really, really important. It's not that we can't have conflicts. We all have conflicts, but we have to know them. We have to understand them. We have to manage them. So that's really, really important. And then as far as the comments about the whistleblower, I am always happy, and I think everyone else here is happy to hear from any of you if you have concerns about what we do in our research, in our clinical work, in our training. Like I said, we're humans. We're not safe from making mistakes, and we need to talk to each other about that. So thank you very much for this great presentation.